Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for participating in today's Climate Action 8x8 series of talks. My name is Siobhan Bradley, and I'm a founding member of the Los Angeles chapter of Gallery Climate Coalition. I'm delighted to be joining today's meeting, which was organized by Art and Climate Action San Francisco and Galleries Commit in New York. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started today. First, I am happy to announce that ACA will be posting the recordings of the spring community meetings on their website and YouTube channel shortly. I think Devin will be sending some links in the chat to access those. Next, please note this will actually be our last virtual community meeting for the rest of the summer, and we'll pick the meetings back up in September. And then finally, as always, today's meeting is being recorded so that it will appear in the YouTube channel later on in case you want to return to it in the future or share it with some colleagues. So today we will be learning about sustainable approaches to materials. We will hear from Russell Fortmeyer, the Global Sustainability Leader of Woods Bagot, as well as Kim Kraczon, the Director of Materials at Key Culture. To give some background, Russell is an engineer and an architect who has worked in sustainability at various scales for the last 20 years. Among many exciting career achievements, in 2019, he actually directed the technical team that developed the Green New Deal for the city of LA, which mapped a plan for zero emissions by 2050. Kim Kraczon is a conservator of modern materials and contemporary art, specializing in sustainable practices within the art sector. As mentioned, she is the Director of Materials at Key Culture, which is an amazing nonprofit that provides education, programs, and tools to make the art sector more sustainable. So we'll hear from Russell first, and then Kim. We'll then have a Q&A session before concluding our meeting. As you can see, the schedule is pretty tight, so at this time, I'm going to pass on to Russell.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to share some slides. So I have a lot of slides, but I talk really fast, and I'm going to give you a crash course in kind of three different models of sustainability. I have to do, I promise I'll do a quick commercial really quick, but Woods Bagot, we're a global architecture firm. We work around the world, blah, blah, blah. London, New York, San Francisco, LA. We started in Adelaide, Australia in the 1860s. So we're real old, but we work on a lot of arts and cultural institutions around the world. So maybe you've come across us. This is probably our biggest cultural project right now. It's the Takari Aboriginal Arts Centre in Adelaide, which is a collaboration we're doing with Diller's Scofidio Renfro, which you probably know them. Since they just did the big MoMA remodel. And then my role is really promoting sustainability within the firm and with our clients. Our climate playbook kind of lays out our broad sustainability approach. You can download that off of our website, woodsbagot.com. Oh, great. So my agenda, we're going to talk about carbon, which is a huge thing. I feel like it's all I talk about sometimes. Equity, and some emerging models around what I would call ethical procurement, and then circularity. So the first thing I would just say is all these things are kind of related to materials. And I think when you think about materials, you have to think in these broad terms, right? Because these are really three different ways to approach a materials strategy. And this is something the American Institute of Architects has a materials pledge that really helps architecture firms like ourselves and really any organization develop a kind of comprehensive approach to the procurement of materials, products, assemblies, the stuff that we buy to make things happen. So when you think about a gallery, you're thinking about your walls, you're thinking about your mechanical systems, your lighting, anything you might have on a temporary basis to support an exhibition, back of house, all those sorts of things. So let's talk about carbon first. So just so we're all on the same page, carbon, what we're really going to focus on is the supply chain. And the impacts of carbon. When we buy something, like when we buy an iPhone, what are all of the steps along the way from extraction of the materials that go into the phone until it arrives on your doorstep? So manufacturing, processing, a lot of shipping of all this material around the world. And so what a carbon footprint does, or a life cycle assessment does, is look at that entire supply chain. So just so we're all, again, I'm giving you like a crash course. When we think about carbon, there's 3 different kinds of carbon in terms of scopes and how we measure it. I'm talking about scope 3. Scope 3 includes things that we purchase, materials, products that we install either permanently or temporarily. Scopes 1 and 2, which you hear mostly about in the news, is energy. And so it's the energy we used. Maybe your gallery or institution has a fleet of vehicles owned by the gallery. Those would be scope 1 emissions, right? The gas that you burn, all those sorts of things. If you buy power from a utility company, that's a scope 2 emission. So you can elect to have green power, for example, and have 0 scope 2 emissions for your footprint. But scope 3 is much, much harder because it's kind of like, it's like Gilligan's Island. It's all the rest. And so when we think about materials, we focus on scope 3, and it's that embodied carbon. So on the right, on this slide is an approach to life cycle assessment. And the thing that's really important with life cycle assessment is to define a system boundary. So what are you going to measure? Are you going to measure everything from raw materials acquisition until end of life? Or are you measuring just when the product is produced and you install it in your gallery and that's it? And so it's really important, I think, anytime you're looking at data, and this is what carbon really comes down to, is how good is your data and do you have enough of it to have a clear picture? You have to be real clear with system boundaries. So to give you an idea, like this was a study we did when I was previously at the engineering firm ERA. We did a study on timber, right? Like, does timber make sense as a material in architecture when you think about the whole life cycle of growing a forest, transporting that to a mill, milling it, using it, and then the end of life? And timber is a carbon positive product. It pulls more carbon out of the atmosphere than it emits across its life cycle. And so those are the kinds of products we're really focused on, is how can we use buildings, anything that's a permanent installation, as a carbon sink, and we make sure that we capture that carbon, because we've got way too much carbon, and that's leading to global warming. So materials life cycle assessment is about transparency. And so what I've been talking about is really on the bottom there, right? And we use something called environmental product declarations. These are what manufacturers put together that we can look at and understand the carbon footprint, the embodied carbon of a material or a product. Which is not to say let's not look at health product declarations, which are like, are there nasty things in the material itself that might hurt our health? And a health product declaration is a similar thing. So I'll show you an example, right? Like a health product declaration, not many companies do this, but it's going to tell you, does this material contain carcinogens? Is it inert and it won't harm you? Or is it something that if it catches on fire, like PVC, for example, you don't want to be anywhere near PVC if it's on fire. So this is an emerging area. Like I said, not many products and manufacturers offer health product declarations, but it's certainly where things are going. But something like, I thought I'd pick an Aeron chair, because you probably all know the Herman Miller Aeron chair. It's famous. There's a lot of, Herman Miller's done a lot to assess the life cycle impact of that chair. You can get an environmental product declaration right off their website. Tells you the carbon footprint. It tells you all the other certifications they're using. It's cradle to cradle certified, which means they've really looked at that full supply chain for this chair. They've analyzed it, and they've been transparent about that data. So you can make a smart choice if you're looking at the Aeron chair versus another chair where maybe you don't get that level of transparency. If you care about that. Now in California, we have a recent bill that was signed into law last year called AB 2446, which is seeking to reduce embodied carbon in the built environment 40% by 2035. So this is looking across all of the stages and so you see that A1 through D. When we do a life cycle assessment, we can choose to include those stages or not. And so again, this is where you get to that system boundary. A lot of LCAs I'm seeing right now kind of don't include end of life or beyond the life cycle. So that C1 through D stage, we're mostly focused on A1 through A5 in my industry, because when I'm done with the building, it's up to you to maintain and use it. So I'm generally doing embodied carbon assessments of A1 through A5, but the state's really interested in that full life cycle. So this is not really going to become something we have to do in our industry until 2025, but it means we're all kind of scrambling to figure this out and start incorporating it into the way we work. If you're a tiny gallery and you're like, 100 square feet, probably you don't have to worry so much about this. If well, you're probably not 100 square feet, but let's say you're a 50,000 square foot warehouse, then you would have to worry about this. What I think this is going to do is encourage us to reuse buildings and focus on adaptive reuse a lot more in architecture. And we can analyze this. There's lots of tools at Woods Bagot. We use EC3, which is a free tool. You could Google EC3, you could download that, you could learn a lot about that tool. It was developed by the University of Washington. It includes a whole bunch of environmental product declaration data in the model. It's mostly about structure, primary structure. So if you're trying to say assess how many walls to put up, or what to make your walls out of, it may not be as granular, but you can certainly do that. There are other tools out there. Tally is one. There's another one, One-Click LCA, which is quite good and pretty comprehensive. This is an emerging marketplace, but there are some leaders, and I like EC3 because it's free. All right, ethical procurement, moving right along. This is a tool that came out maybe 3 or 4 years ago called the Design for Freedom Toolkit. This came out of a couple of conferences with people in the architecture and design industry to kind of say, hey, wait a minute, all this focus on carbon is great, but what about the people who make this stuff? And how are they treated? Do they have rights to organize? Do they have rights to healthcare? All the kinds of things that we would expect. And so what the Design for Freedom Toolkit does is try and make that kind of the equitable nature of supply chains more transparent. And so it really asks the question, where does stuff come from? How do we reduce risks? How do we start to drive change? How do we send signals to the market that we care about this stuff? And so it is really a toolkit. It will give you things like this supplier questionnaire. Again, this is totally free. You can go to the website, download all this stuff. But if you were to say, oh, we have a supplier we always use for plasterboard panels for our exhibitions, I would send them this supplier questionnaire, and I'd spend an hour on the phone walking them through that and say, this is important to us. And maybe you want to talk to other suppliers and see who, start to use this as a way to get your suppliers to step up. They'll have to do work on their end. So this is not, this is not an easy process. It's one of the reasons our industry has not been that advanced in sort of doing this. Okay, got to move along here. And so there's lots of other things, lots of other resources. If you're doing an architecture project, all those kinds of things, if you're working with an architect, you should bring this up. But again, I was going to say it's going to take a lot of time to work this through. Okay, let me see. Why is it not? Yeah. It also kind of feeds into modern slavery. So we have a modern slavery policy at Woods Bagot. This is very common outside of the United States. It's becoming more common in the US. This is just an excerpt from ours. You're welcome to take a look at it or download it if you want. But we're really looking at procurement and our suppliers and doing more due diligence on that. And that's what a modern slavery policy is really meant to do. So Design for Freedom is really putting modern slavery into action. Finally, I might just click through these slides, but really quickly. But we've kind of pulled a lot of this together for an exhibition in Milan at the Design Triennale in 2019. We worked with Human Scale in this case to look at a stool. This is the exhibition installation actually, but we wanted to compare a conventional metal stool to like 3 different versions of that. One made out of landfill waste, one grown out of mushrooms, one made out of plastic harvested from the ocean. And so I share this because there are a lot of new materials out there that you could explore using in a gallery scenario that significantly reduce carbon and might improve the ethics of your supply chain, because you're able to source things within your community and help foster kind of new business. So this was a material grown from mushrooms. Here's what the stool looked like. I could talk a lot about this. There was a circular economy approach, right? Like, how do we reuse stuff that's already in the economy? And that was the trash. This UBQ material is actually an Israeli company that makes this. It's all post-consumer landfill waste, and it's like a really hard substrate. And then finally, we used a sort of biomimicry process, looking at nature. In this case, ocean, the Venus flower basket and the skeletal structure of that, to fabricate a stool out of this recycled plastic pulled out of the ocean. And then we performed a life cycle assessment of this, looking at all of these kind of key indicator categories. Sorry, I'm really flipping through this fast. And then broke that down by each of the stool alternatives. And I'll just get to the comparison. And so you see on that outer, the 100% is the life cycle assessment done on the metal stool. That's our baseline, right? So what are we comparing against? And I think you can see, from our perspective, the closed loop stool, this was the one made out of trash, significantly reduces things like water consumption, significantly reduces waste, because of course we're pulling waste out of the environment. So you can actually boil this down to science and make reasonable comparisons, right? So with that, sorry, I think I went a minute over, but thank you. There's your crash course.
Thank you, Russell. And I'll now pass to you, Kim.
Sure, yeah, thank you very much for having me this morning. Yeah, so I'm going to be speaking today about another approach, aside from circular economy, to materials. We're going to start with waste. So we previously called this subtopic of sustainability waste and materials a key culture, but when we think about the term waste, it connotes a material that doesn't serve a purpose and is worthless, and we want to reshape how we think about materials. So this is an obvious example, but a cardboard shipping box, right? After you receive a delivery of a product in a cardboard box, we can perceive this box as having served its purpose and discard it in a waste bin, or hopefully the recycling bin. But can it serve another purpose? Can you reuse it or repurpose it in another capacity? So we remove the term waste from our vocabulary key culture. And again, we want to urge everyone to recontextualize our relationship with materials and think about keeping them in useful circulation out of the landfill or recycling facilities for as long as possible, preferably indefinitely, which Russell addressed in his talk on the circular economy. So one of the participants in the Key Futures program redefined waste as excess surplus, which I love, and is very much in line with moving towards the circular economy. But how does recycling then fit into the circular economy? So many assume recycling is an effective way to reduce waste. So let's dive into these three types of recycling. We have upcycling, which is taking a material and transforming it into something more valuable than the original material. So a great example of this is taking old posters or signage from an exhibition and making tote bags out of them to sell at the museum shop. Recycling in its purest form is processing a material and converting it into a new material of equal value. So this is typically applied to metals such as aluminum, which can be remelted and reused in the same value. And then we have downcycling. So this is when a material is processed and turned into something of lesser value. So this is typically the case with plastics, as most plastics lose valuable characteristics in the recycling process. So when the material is broken down, the polymer chains are also broken and the material can become more permeable, more brittle, less transparent, and less flexible. So as many of you are hopefully aware, plastic recycling isn't as commonplace as we've been led to believe. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the stat that only 8 to 9% of all plastics ever manufactured have been recycled. And there are a few reasons for this. The first one being the challenge of sorting different types of polymers for the recycling process. So plastics are recycled by their polymer group, of which there are 7. Well, actually 6 distinct polymer groups, and the 7th is anything that doesn't fit into the other 6 groups. And these polymers can't be mixed together in the recycling process. Sorting the various polymer types is expensive and the technology is lacking. Piggybacking on that concept, products and packaging waste comprising 2 or more different polymer types cannot be recycled. Bubble wrap, along with plastic films and plastic bags, also pose a problem in these facilities because they get caught in the recycling machinery. So this means that soft plastics such as the ones we use in production and transport. Gloves, bubble wrap, Tyvek, and polyfilms are typically incinerated under the euphemism of energy recovery. And while some energy is generated from burning plastics, it's not the most efficient fuel source for energy and additionally generates airborne pollutants. And here's some fun facts about plastics for you guys. The recycling myth. So yeah, we toss materials that are theoretically recyclable into the recycling bin. But as we just addressed, the majority of these plastics we toss into the bin are not in fact curbside recyclable, meaning picked up and processed by your local waste management. Again, it's important to keep in mind that the recyclability of plastics is regionally specific. And I urge everyone to reach out to their local waste management to inquire about their recycling policies. But I have to warn you, the answers you receive are undoubtedly very disappointing, but this also encourages mindfulness when making consumer purchases in your daily life. So I contacted my waste management company in Berlin, for example, to inquire about the likelihood of our packaging materials from my previous workplace getting recycled. So this is packing foams, Tyvek, plastic bags, bubble wrap, and only 30% of plastic packaging is recycled in Berlin, and the rest is incinerated. So these numbers will vary depending on where you live and which waste management company you're dealing with. Yes, but even so, there's some take back programs for these materials. For example, Tyvek has a take back program in the States with no minimum quantity required for recycling. But as I previously outlined, reducing the consumption of plastics is far more effective in mitigating environmental burden than recycling. So this is just an article that I came across from NPR a few months ago. So at this point, maybe some of you are probably thinking, but we have biodegradable and compostable plastics to the rescue. Well, that is not entirely true. So you've probably come across bioplastics or bio-based consumer products in your supermarkets or through your own research on packaging materials. So let's first define these terms. So bioplastics is the umbrella term for plastics that are either bio-based, biodegradable, compostable, or both. So this means that even traditional petrochemical plastics, such as polyethylene, can be manufactured with additives to catalyze the degradation process and still fall under the definition of bioplastic. Bioplastics are also considered, bio-based plastics are also considered bioplastics, but are derived from renewable biomass such as corn, sugarcane, and cellulose. What this means that a PE foam manufactured with ethanol derived from sugarcane, which has the same exact properties as polyethylene foam derived from fossil fuels, still falls under the definition of a bioplastic. So there's a ton of greenwashing associated with these materials, and it's really important to read through the lines. And the biggest takeaway from defining these terms is that bioplastic and bio-based doesn't always indicate that the material is biodegradable. I mean, they're manufactured in part from natural renewable resources, but more research is needed on their comprehensive environmental burdens. There's some conflicting information out there. So many bioplastics are also marketed as compostable, which is, in my opinion, an example of greenwashing. So these eco-friendly, quote, eco-friendly PLA products, PLA stands for polylactic acid, claim to be certified 100% compostable. But this particular material requires industrial composting to degrade, and these facilities typically do not accept this material. So when thrown away in a regular trash bin, PLA does not compost and behaves as any other petrochemical plastic that ends up in a landfill. And because compostable plastics don't add any nutrients to the compost, they are undesirable for these industrial compost facilities and sorted out and added to mixed waste. Another issue with PLA is that it's often confused with other plastics and contaminates the recycling stream. So I just really want to impress that these plastics don't magically dissolve when you toss them into the trash bin. And they also cannot be successfully composted at home. A PLA bottle could take anywhere from 100 to 1,000 years to decompose in a landfill, and also emits methane as it's decomposing. And this is, I think this is, I did some quick research in the States. This is your compostable logo, but this means that it's industrial. It requires industrial compost, which I find misleading. Okay, so relying on recyclable and compostable plastics is not the answer. The only solution is to reduce our plastic consumption and reuse materials indefinitely. So if recycling isn't a viable option, how do we minimize plastic waste, or any waste for that matter? So when thinking about the use of plastics or any materials in our daily lives or practice, it's useful to reference the 5 R's in the waste hierarchy. So we have refusing at the top, we have reducing, reuse, repurpose, and recycling is at the very, very bottom as an absolute last resort. And this is a page from the Waste and Materials Key Book, which, if you don't know, it's an online sustainability manual for collections, care, and transport. It's free to download on the Key Culture website. It's also very outdated. It's already 3 years old, but we're working on an updated version this summer. So keep an eye out for that. So let's use bubble wrap as an example. We're all familiar with it as a packaging material. So applying the concepts from the waste hierarchy, the first R is refuse. So can you redesign the crating method in a way that doesn't necessitate this packaging material? Or is there another material that you can use in place of bubble wrap, such as a padded blanket that can be reused many, many times, which is also in line with the circular economy. So next in the hierarchy is reduce. So is it necessary to triple wrap an artwork in bubble wrap? Can you reduce the quantity of the material? Again, by rethinking the crating method. And then reuse is ensuring that the packaging material does not become damaged during the uncrating process. So this translates into using adhesive tapes that do not damage the packaging material as you're unwrapping it. And the GCC website actually has a resource that outlines the best combination of various adhesive tapes and various substrate packaging materials to ensure their reuse. So you can check that out. I want to show you guys some examples here real quick of redesigning crates. So this is from Olafur Eliasson's studio. I previously worked there. This artwork's just wrapped in Tyvek. The entire crate's packed with polyurethane foam. Just such an unnecessary use of this material. And then in 2021, you can see just by redesigning the crate, there's wooden braces, a very thin lining of polyethylene foam, craft paper as a dust cover, and then paper cushions on top to keep the artwork in place while it's being shipped. Then I also have been working with White Cube in London through the GCC. They're testing honeycomb cardboard packaging, putting loggers in there. They have dummy crates with dummy frames. I just want to say it's a case-by-case risk assessment necessary, as these materials do not have a one-to-one equivalent to polyethylene foams and polyurethane foams, but they can be used. To quickly go through this. So then there's some material selection resources, Stitch and Item-Out. Item-Out is an app for product designers. It's really easy to use. A lot of the materials that you encounter in cultural heritage are also listed there, but the issue with this app in Stitch is that it only looks at the carbon footprint, right? And you know, as Russell also touched upon, it's a very, very nuanced when you're looking at the entire comprehensive environmental burden of materials. So there's other impact categories which also were touched upon. So land use, water footprint, eutrophication, acidification, toxicity to both humans and the ecosystem. There's environmental justice issues. And all of these should factor into your decision-making process. So if we went by carbon alone, I would be promoting plastics in this presentation because they have a relatively low carbon footprint. And some people do promote plastics for that reason. But something that's coming soon from GCC, we're in the very preliminary research phase, is creating a materials calculator that is representative of all the impact categories. So not just carbon footprint, but so a more comprehensive evaluation of materials. And then again, just keep an eye out for the Waste and Materials Key Book. There's a ton of new research that will be added to that. And yeah, that's it. I think we're done.
Thanks so much, Kim.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so I appreciate everyone's time, and I realize it's 10. I think that you know, if anyone has some questions, maybe we can stay on till about 10:05. I see Jody's asking, do you know when that resource from GCC will be available?
Oh, no. It's very much, again, we just started looking into the research, and you know, we'll see if it's even feasible. You know, there's open source databases yeah, we need to talk to some people and vet our proposed process in this. But also calculators are really expensive to produce. There's quite a few steps there. So I wouldn't say anytime this year. Definitely not. Hopefully
Sure.
next.
Do we have any other questions for Kim and Russell at this time?
Kim, I don't
Looking
know if this
around.
is a question that can go to you because I don't know how involved you are. Are you involved with the stitch calculator at all?
No, I'm not.
Okay, my question was knowing more about kind of the timeline for getting more like non-carbon and additional material updates on that, because that's also such a good resource, just like needs more content on it.
Yeah, exactly. I know that's the problem. It doesn't. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of materials represented on Stitch. I know that they're planning on adding more, but that's why I mean ItemAd has more materials and it's a little more comprehensive. There's also eco cost, which isn't. I guess it can be an indicator for certain things. It's more about in product design.
I have another question for Russell, if I can dominate the questions, which is like, Russell, after listening to Kim's presentation and some of like the art sector resources and material calculators they're coming out, like do you have any thoughts about like what's going on in the architecture world and how it's relating to the visual art world?
Yeah, you know what, and I really enjoyed Kim's deep dive on stuff because it's like things fall apart easily in this world when you start getting real and specific. You're like, oh, I thought, from afar, it was making me think from like afar, you can make these grand idealistic plans, but then when you get into the very specific details, you're like, oh, it's not what I thought it was. And I think that's why I was sort of thinking, I know I threw a lot of models at everybody, but that's why I think it's important. The first step is to really just sit down and figure out what's important to you. Where are your biggest impacts as an organization? You could look at your budget and see where you're spending money. And that's where, and it's highly likely that where you're spending money is where you're spending carbon, is where you're making the biggest impact on environments and communities elsewhere. And it's where you have the biggest opportunity, I think, to change that. So I think prioritizing is that important first step. And if packaging, I realize like shipping and all that packaging is a huge impact for you all. That's a great place to start. And it's really awesome to see that model. But that's why I would just say, it's like I kept using the word emerging because ethical procurement of like, even just if you take that packaging, like where do you start with, like where are you sourcing the wood, or where, who's that from? Is there an opportunity to make an intentional procurement decision around where that comes from? I think that it's important to do something that you can manage and you can have some wins and start to tell a story and build that momentum. I think where I see it becoming overwhelming in architecture is that we have that kind of regulatory side from the state focused on carbon. But I think people in architecture have woken up, really thanks to BLM and Me Too, and really thinking about the impacts we have on communities that are producing the stuff that we use. And it's really hard, I think, even though in Australia, every corporation has adopted modern slavery policies, does that mean we'd have no modern slavery in products in Australia? No, absolutely not. Of course we do. So there's exploited labor here in the United States, right? It exists here. And so I think it's really challenging. That's why I think it's like you prioritize, you focus on the material impacts that you're making, and you try and get some quick wins to build some momentum.
I see that Neha has her hand raised in the chat, and I'm wondering if we just have time for one more question.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Kim and Russell, for really informative presentations. I am a climate justice advocate and a contemporary eco artist. I just found this so incredibly insightful. My question is, in your awareness, is there any initiative to develop some kind of a fair trade approach or some kind of a fair trade a certification for the art ecosystem to adopt some standard practices, as there is this really very complex ecosystem that is for each to apply to our practices and organizations. I realize a lot of this is so formative, but I'm wondering if there is any conversation or actions around that.
I would say on like Tim, just to go back to timber and wood and paper products, there's a certification called Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, and you probably see that a lot. You might see it on like a greeting card that you buy from Target even. That is a very robust certification program, and it not only includes environmental impacts in terms of sustainable forest management, but also the communities that work in those forests, and do they have labor rights? You know, are they able to unionize? All those kinds of like those kinds of human rights things that we would look for. So that's a really great example. Like I don't see one that, you know, the challenge in this world, in the materials world, is that all of these materials are different categories of the economy. And so it's very hard to find a single thing that really talk to all of them. And so you kind of get into these category specific certifications, and FSC is a really good one. Cradle to Cradle is a really good one on the environmental side, but very, very few products use it. Yeah, so again, I think as there's more transparency and there's more demand for that transparency, I think that'll change.
Okay, great. I want to thank Russell and Kim so much for your time this morning to educate us on this subject. I personally have learned so much. And thank you everyone for participating. I know that we went over time and time is precious. So we will look forward to seeing you all again in September. And yeah, have a great summer, I guess.